Spirit animals are a funny concept. Funny being a placeholder word for kind of stupid. First, we seem to be very picky with the attributes we pluck from animals, taking the good while completely disregarding the bad. For instance, if one were to say their spirit animal was a lion, we'd think of them as brave and noble rather than a person who licks his own balls. Second, the concept of spirit animals necessitates some hardcore anthropomorphizing. Snakes are often perceived as conniving when they are borderline inert and, as far as we can tell, fundamentally incapable of problem solving or the hatching of plans. Plus, we are incredibly selective of the animals we associate human traits with. Why is nobody's spirit animal a fruit fly or bacteria? Everybody picks a cool animal, like a wolf or an eagle, instead of being honest with themselves and recognizing that they really aren't that impressive. My spirit animal is a hermit crab, and I'm proud of that. If I could buy a human-sized shell to live in for the rest of my life, you better believe I would, especially in this economy. Good morning, after eve night, Cosmoronic number 8. I'm Fringin', I hope you're all doing well. So, last night, I watched I, Robot with Mauler and Jay. That I have not seen that film in a long time. I remember watching it when I was a kid, but I haven't seen it in years. And the reason why this was prompted is because Jay had discovered a really cool line from the film. I'm paraphrasing, but the line was essentially Will Smith's character asks Sonny, the robot, can a robot like paint a piece of art or compose a symphony? To which he retorts, "Can you?" And then there's no response. That's a really great line for a film that I think we all generally remember vaguely as being not that great. And so out of curiosity, we decided to watch it. And now, I guess to preface the discussion, I haven't read the book, but it's definitely one of the ones that's high up on the list. In fact, it feels like a really significant oversight, especially considering how fascinating I find robotics and artificial intelligence to be. But I mean, a lot of the material from those books is sort of seeped into the public consciousness anyway, right? Like the 3 laws of robotics originated from Isaac Asimov's stories. And in part, like whether or not it's the 3 laws or other, aspects of that idea have just reached those stories anyway. But nevertheless, we watched the film and oddly enough, the film was alright up until a point. Like, there was downright good stuff in this film. Lines where it's like, oh, that's interesting, or conversations where it's like, oh, we got some subtext going on here, that's neat. It's not like high praise or anything, but it was still cool to see. Unfortunately, by the time that we reach the 3rd act, the film completely falls off the rails and derails into a much dumber story than it was before. You look at the first half of the film, or like the first 2/3 of the film, we are exploring some of those interesting subjects about artificial intelligence. But, unfortunately, in the 3rd act, it feels like they gave up on exploring the more interesting aspects of artificial intelligence and resorted to, the robots are bad and the humans are going to save the day. It ultimately decides to take a simplistic route rather than a more multi-layered and complex route. Probably because the filmmakers weren't willing to grapple with an uncomfortable, likely truth, which is that AI is probably going to take over and we're probably going to be cool with it, and maybe that's not so bad. Oh man, do I really want to talk about artificial intelligence this early in the day? That is such a broad topic that I find so fascinating, and it's interesting to look at that film where it goes beyond just scraping the surface at first, but then it falls apart at the end. Oh, I guess it is worth noting that that film is there are some just stupid plot points. I remember the film was doing all right for a while, and then they had the set piece where Will Smith is driving through the tunnel, and then these 2 massive trucks. And for those of you who haven't seen the film, we are told that all cars drive themselves. An interesting example of predicting what would happen in the future. There were some aspects of the film that predicted it quite well. Of course, there are other things where it's like, Like, for instance, the robots themselves I don't ever see us having widely distributed robots with these creepy faces. It is way more likely that you are going to get what they had in the film with the original robots with very simplistic faces. That seems way more likely to me. But, I'm getting distracted. He's driving down this tunnel with these cars that drive themselves at super high speeds, but he decides to go manual when these two massive trucks lock him in, and then all the evil robots, whose interior light goes red, just so that we know that they're evil, start attacking him. It's like, man. We later find out that Vicky, the city's, artificial intelligence construct, is responsible for all of this. And, if you are a super duper computer brain that is in charge of an entire city, I would expect that you can do a better job of killing somebody than throwing a bunch of robots at them on a high-speed freeway. The film constantly underestimates robots, If we're talking about a robot that is presumably pretty intelligent, I think it's safe to say based on what they do in this film, that they are pretty agile and pretty intelligent. Human reaction times are not awesome. Robot reaction times are basically perfect. Or at least as close to perfect as you can ever get. If Will Smith wants to throw a punch, that robot's dodging it every time. Because it's going to be able to identify what's happening and react to it far faster than any human being can. Will Smith gets a huge advantage in that film because he has a robot hand that's really strong. But nevertheless, the robots are winning. Feels like the clear example here of, we've decided to resort to the simplistic humans win the day with their ingenuity or something, because apparently robots, there's no way. There's absolutely no way. If the robot decides to take over the city, that's the end of it. But she allows them to get into the building, and then when they get apprehended but they escape, it takes her a good 5 minutes to do anything about it. They go to her brain to shut it down, and it's not already locked down. It is accessible, and it is even possible for the main characters to, for about a minute or so, try to access the brain with, a security code before this robot, this big, superintendent, overseer robot, shuts it down, and then Will Smith just punches the machine, and then it's like, there we go, now we can use it again. From what I understand, I, Robot the film and I, Robot the book are not very similar at all. At the end of the film, instead of saying it's, adapted from I, Robot, it says, suggested by Isaac Asimov's book, which is an interesting way to credit it. I guess it's more honest, right? No, you know what? I want to talk about AI. It feels like I find artificial intelligence to be an incredibly fascinating concept. It's super interesting to me because it feels like there are so many questions that arise from the subject, not only in terms of how it would work or what it would even mean for, artificial intelligence to exist, what kind of intelligence would it be? Would it be conscious? But also just, how is it going to change the world? It feels like whenever already right now we have something that is artificial intelligence, right? We have machine learning. We have programs that are pretty good at identifying trends and things like that. In a way, they have emergent properties, but not in the way that I think we all would view it in terms of an artificial intelligence that is truly, self-aware and sentient. That seems to be a very different bar. I guess it's funny, because we still don't understand a whole lot about consciousness when it pertains to ourselves, or whether other animals are conscious, how they emote, or anything like that. But it feels like a lot of widely accepted notions about the limitations of AI just seem misguided to me. Is there any reason to believe that AI will be incapable of creating art, especially when AI can already do that to a limited extent? Is there any... you think about, the Turing test. I know that was the core concept in Ex Machina, right? If a robot passes the Turing test and is able to convince you that it's a human being, what does that even mean in terms of how it reflects on them? And is it a distinction without a difference, If a robot is able to convince you that it is alive and feeling and thinking, but it's not, what does that really matter if the only way that humans can engage with that robot is in a way that it seems human-like. Artificial intelligence may well be... A lot of stories present artificial intelligence as having human attributes to some extent. Like, that's a common thing in a lot of stories where we look at a robot that either develops or has, like, human attributes. They might have a few quirks, but they're very human-like. And it almost feels like we are thinking that intelligence itself necessitates emotion. I don't want to present, because there are plenty of stories that present AI as being, like, completely cold calculus. But it's just something to think about. Does intelligence necessitate emotion? Like, does it necessarily entail emotion? And if it doesn't, you know, would AI simply be, like, it would be simply intelligent without being emotional? Would that not just... It would just be a different form of consciousness rather than unconsciousness. Would it or wouldn't it? I don't know. But, you know, the question ultimately would be, what even is the distinction? What does it matter? I think, I know that there's a lot of speculation when it comes to artificial intelligence of that concept, the singularity, where artificial intelligence will reach the point where it is basically fully sentient and self-learning, and its capacity to change itself, like it develops the capacity to change itself and do so and learn exponentially from that point onward. Like, that would be a significant inflection point for humanity, you know? I know that seems like when that will happen is not something that people agree on, that it could happen in like 20 years or 30 years, or that potentially it is physically, like, it's impossible. Feels like something we often don't think about when it comes to technology is, oh damn, might that not be possible at all, just like physically. I wouldn't know, because I don't understand that stuff so very well. The conversation in the film that prompted us to rewatch it, the "Can you compose a symphony, can you?" That to me is a very fascinating line, because it feels very indicative of a perception that we have of artificial intelligence, that it is... I think that we are, or it will become more evident soon, that we are desperate as human beings to distinguish ourselves from everything else. To in some way clearly distill that we are special and super duper cool and unique. And it seems likely to me that if we were to develop artificial intelligence that reaches a stage where it is basically better than us at doing everything, it is able to do these things completely rationally and clinically and very quickly, but nevertheless emulate or improve on what human beings can do, that it is going to be very challenging for us to deal with that. You know, what happens? This is something I've thought about a lot, partly because I want to write stories, and I guess this is simultaneously fascinating to me and a little bit scary. What if we imagine at some stage in the future that you are able to create a bot that makes stories, and it is able to create stories that it knows will be appealing to the vast majority of people? Or if we push it further, we have a robot that will write stories specifically for you. Like, it will procedurally generate stories for you specifically, because we see the examples now, right, of like bots that are run by Google or Facebook or whatever that are able to accumulate a vast amount of information on an individual and then present them with ads that they know that person is going to be more likely to look at and click or be, you know, register in their mind than what we used to do with television, where they just throw ads on and hope that some of them stick. Bots that are capable of these things definitely exist already, in a more rudimentary sense, obviously, but it feels like it's only ever going to get better from here, right? It'll reach a point, I imagine, where artificial intelligence will be able to understand you as an individual more so than you will. And if that's the case, and you had a bot that could write stories that specifically you will love, because it understands what your interests are, I guess deep-seated problems emotionally that you still need to reconcile, and it can create stories that are maximally potent for you. Could you imagine that, if you could just have a bot that will write stories just for you that you're going to love, and it can do so at a blistering pace? It is, in a sense, the opposite of the monkey at the typewriter experiment, where if you give them an infinite amount of time, they'll write a great American novel. The converse is that it doesn't need any time at all to persistently write the greatest novels that you're ever going to read. Or, if we went a little bit more ambitious, that it could just fully render films that you're going to love. Is there any reason to believe that that's not going to be possible, that a robot can't do this? Is there any reason to presume that the emotional aspect that we as humans find as a drive to do these things, that we as humans have our drive to express ourselves creatively because of, what's inside of us, our emotions, is there any reason to believe that a robot couldn't just do that completely clinically, but still emulate the experience, or perhaps even improve upon it, have a stronger understanding of art and storytelling, and just life in general than a human being could ever cultivate, just because it has because it's just so smart. Like it has the ability to process information at a rate that we simply cannot match. I mentioned earlier, but we've seen examples of artificial intelligence that can create music, and we've seen more rudimentary examples of artificial intelligence that can create art. But even though it's not there yet, it's something, right? It's something that's possible right now, or even a few years ago, and it's only ever going to improve from there, because it feels like at this point there is just a real interest in continuing to develop artificial intelligence for pretty obvious reasons. It seems very beneficial as a company to have these sort of systems in place. For as much as the Terminator example exists and persists in pop culture, there is really no resistance at all on our part towards moving towards artificial intelligence. It's never gonna not happen, we can't hit the brakes on this. We are just heading in that direction. And I suppose it all leads to that inevitable question, right, with artificial intelligence. If we create some super duper awesome artificial intelligence, is it going to be benevolent, or is it going to be super duper evil and want to get rid of us? The question Terminator poses is not one that I would consider to be simplistic at all. I think it is a totally fair question to ask. If we created robots, might they just, through some cold clinical calculus, decide that it's worthwhile to just get rid of us and do their own thing? The grey goo, not affiliated with my goo, obviously, the grey goo hypothesis of, nanomachines running wild and destroying the planet and turning it into grey goo. But then you have other examples as well. Deus Ex has a through line of essentially the machine god, and there were hints of that as well in, Mankind Divided of the Machine God, and of course it appears in other media as well. The idea that if you created an artificial intelligence construct that was incredibly sophisticated and had a lot of processing power, what if you just had a construct that was linked to basically every human mind on the planet and was able to receive way more information than any human being could ever process and make decisions that would yield the optimal results for the most amount of people, taking into account all of their specific needs in a way that no human ever could with that many people, and with more knowledge than any human would ever really be able to attain about these people, and to get all of that information together and make these decisions. The interesting thing to me about that is that doesn't seem all that dystopic to me. I think I am a lot more pro-machine god than the average person. I find it very difficult to think about how I can value human consciousness compared to artificial intelligence consciousness in terms of what the distinction is and how much that matters, or whether there's reason to be afraid of a potential form of intelligence that may well just be superior. Depends on what we mean by superior, though, right? What is it depends on what we value, but then again, we choose what we value, right? So But it seems like universally humans value the human experience for pretty obvious reasons. And I think that there's that concern that that if you had like some artificial intelligence construct that had such power, that there would just the inevitable result of that would surely be the erasure of human consciousness. It's a common thing that, a common thought in like science fiction stories where people would just merge into the artificial intelligence, that whatever distinction exists between humans and computers would slowly be eroded away with like bionic parts or, chips in your brain or anything like that. And then eventually you would just reach that point. I mean, no matter what happens in the future, human beings are not going to persist forever. Either we'll die out, we'll evolve into something that is different, or we will ourselves make ourselves different from what we are right now. What an elegant sentence. I guess I wonder about the growing pains though between now and Machine God, where I think it's a legitimate concern, a very legitimate concern. It's something that I don't think we talk about enough, right? Like automation is coming, and automation is coming for a lot of jobs. And what are we to do in the meantime between now and that period of automation and then just inevitably submitting to our robot overlords? Like, how are we going to grapple with that situation? I have no idea. Feels like we don't talk about it because, again, we always underestimate. We persistently underestimate new technologies and how disruptive they may end up being. Then again, you did have the dot-com bubble where everybody overestimated how significant the internet was going to be, like 20 years before it really was. It's a mixed bag, isn't it? I remember seeing a cartoon the other day that I think was from the 1920s, where it had like a car sinking into a lake, and the horse is like, haha, you silly car, horses are forever, they will always be around. For those of you who'll be watching this later on, I have seen a suggestion in chat, become a technician to maintain robot arms. That's that big think right there. A thought that's just come to me relating to the Machine God is the idea of values. This is something that I find incredibly fascinating, and I don't know that I would ever be able to figure out an answer to this question. We as human beings tend to just develop values naturally based on our life experiences. There are things that we value. There just are. Like, I don't know that it's possible for a human being to not, like, have a perspective or something that they cherish more so than other things. An idea of what they think the world ought to be. Is there any reason to think that that artificial intelligence is capable, or alternatively incapable, of developing values of their own? Would they necessarily be values that are essentially baked into the code of a machine? But what does that even mean? If a computer can change its own code, if that's something that becomes possible, like that a fully self-sufficient, intelligent, learning, AI is able to make these changes to itself. Can a computer do that? Because, the computer I'm using right now doesn't have any values, right? It just does things. It doesn't have a perspective on, like, when I click on Google Chrome, it's not like, nah, and I'm not just poking like, come on. And he's like, nah, I don't want to. It's not how computers work. They don't have opinions. But if you had a machine god that everybody's mind is linked to, and it's making decisions about what's best for people, regardless of how it operates, it will, by virtue of operating in a certain way, have some sort of value system. If you had one that took into account everybody's perspectives and then used those perspectives to come to the best conclusion for the most people, and that's democracy in a certain sense, right? But also, is it utilitarianism, right? Like, if the majority of people deep down actually want to get rid of certain rights, would the machine allow that to happen? Or, alternatively, would the machine, through more subtle ways, cultivate attitudes within the population that would be more favorable towards its goals? It would certainly be something that a machine that smart could do, right? If you just put the right advertisements there, or you directed people into the right places, gave them the right resources. How would those values arise? Because whatever it does, it will necessarily have values, whether it holds those values or not. We are falling down that rabbit hole, aren't we? Another thought I love space. I love space. I think space is awesome. And I want us as human beings to explore it and spread across space. That seems cool to me. I wonder if an artificial intelligence construct would be as compelled to spread itself across the universe. Like, you know, human beings, we really seem to universally have the desire to expand our domain. We seem to love doing that, regardless of whether there are people on the domain that we seek to capture. Would an artificial intelligence be as compelled to spread out? Would an artificial intelligence system have, like, self-preservation instincts? Because, you know, part of the reason why we want to spread out is, in a certain sense, to hedge our bets. And I would say that that's probably, we could imagine that that was the case all the way back to, like, the beginning of human beings, that the desire to spread out was that there was a certain safety derived from that. And on a universal scale, we can't stay here, you know? Eventually, the sun is gonna gobble us up. He's gonna come towards Earth with a knife and fork in his hands and a little, his napkin tied around its big old sun neck. And he's coming to munch on Earth. And we can't be here, otherwise we're in serious trouble. Now, to be fair, that's 1 billion years away, and in 1 billion years, we're not going to be human beings anymore, no matter what course we take. Like, spreading out is something that we as human beings feel compelled to do, and for as long as it is within our means to do so, I think we will be compelled to do so. To go to the moon, to go to Mars, to go elsewhere. If we reach the point where there were no human beings anymore, whether through the annihilation of human beings or that we essentially merge into computers, what would our objective be at that point? By our, I refer to the computers. What would their objective be? Because a lot of our objectives are derived from seemingly universal drives that we have. That we're greedy, that we want to expand our resources, expand our knowledge, we want to achieve a legacy, we want a purpose in life. Like, my computer doesn't have a purpose right now, it just exists and does things when I interface with it. But if you had a computer that was intelligent, but as far as we can tell, not driven by emotions, what would it want to do? If that computer was left to its own devices, what would it do? Would it just sit around on Earth twiddling its virtual thumbs? Or would it feel compelled to explore the universe to try and learn everything? Or, as has just been suggested in chat, would it simply strive to become more effective? But effective at what? And to what end? Simply for its own sake? I guess it would depend on whether or not a computer would be able to change its parameters in a way that allows itself to naturally develop interests of its own. If an artificial intelligence existed on its own and was able to develop objectives, that doesn't necessarily mean it would be emotional, because it could just see success and failure as two outcomes rather than, oh yay, I did it, or oh, that sucks. Doesn't need that necessarily. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know yet. In case it wasn't obvious, because I only said it a couple of times, I find artificial intelligence to be a highly fascinating subject. It is absolutely something that I want to explore thoroughly through fiction. It is one of the types of stories that I simply feel that I must explore in my own writing. I find it so fascinating. It is I love science fiction anyway, and space and everything like that. Artificial intelligence, though, there are so many questions to think about when it comes to computers and AI and robots. And this is all putting to one side that robots themselves are just pretty cool. I think robots are really cool. But I mean, as for what it means for artificial intelligence to exist, to coexist with us, or to potentially exist beyond us, there's so much to think about. A teaser trailer for Obi-Wan Kenobi was released last week. Most people seem to be hyped. I'm not. I wonder why. I wonder if it has anything to do with all of the Disney Star Wars content that's come out over the last few years. That trailer feels like it was perfectly cut to maximize hype. Like, at this point, it really feels like Disney has figured out how to do it. Play the music that everybody loves. Show the character that everybody loves. And look at these imagery that's recognizable, but then we got slightly new imagery, but it's kind of from extended lore. Ain't that cool? I guess it's just a little lame that it seemingly it's so easy to win people over by using music belonging to a better Star Wars era and having the budget to execute on basically any idea you could ever have. Because that show looks premium. Of course it does. It's clearly got a big budget. They've got the resources. They got all the resources to execute on basically whatever idea they have. And yet, thus far, the writing has been pretty abominable. And I don't know that there's any reason to think that it will be different this time around. One could hope, though, because I do love Obi-Wan, and I don't want them to ruin him. And remember, it's always possible. It's always possible, because you run a risk when writing prequels. I want to speculate on Obi-Wan Kenobi a little bit, but when I say speculation, I don't mean in the conventional sense. That sense being the definition of the word. You know, I don't care to speculate on how the show is going to turn out in reality, because if I talk about it that way, it's probably going to be like a really disappointing conversation. I don't have particularly high hopes for it, is basically where I'm at. But, I don't want to speculate on how it's going to turn out. Instead, I'd like to talk about the stories one could tell in this setting, and broadly some thoughts I've had of late because of the Obi-Wan trailer pertaining to prequels as a concept. There are plenty of stories to tell about Obi-Wan. The period between the prequels and the sequels is certainly fertile ground. It is a thoroughly underexplored period in Star Wars history. We spent a lot of time in the prequel era specifically. We spent a lot of time in the OT era specifically, but the middle ground, we have not seen as much of the middle ground at this point, especially in the Disney Star Wars era, than we have of the middle point between the OT and the sequels. And it is an interesting time, because it's a time when the good guys are on the ropes. The bad guys have won and are continuing to win. And the good guys are simply not in a position to really topple the bad guys. They're just trying to survive. What an interesting time to explore, especially when we're dealing with a character who lived most of his life, up until this point, on the good guys team with authority and power, and influence in the galaxy. But the thing is like I just mentioned before, you gotta tread carefully when slotting a new story into the middle of an existing character's broader narrative, because you have the potential to make or break that character with any new story that you add. This is kind of the risk that you run with, like, any additional stories in general. If you nail it the first time, there's no reason to say that you can't retroactively destroy what came before. It's entirely possible. It's the reason why you gotta be careful, and especially with prequels. Prequels are complicated. Like, it seems difficult for a writer to craft a prequel without it being influenced in some part by the stories which came before, but canonically exist afterward. You know, there is a broad awareness of the meta here. Like, this Obi-Wan story, it is not being created. It is not being created as the middle story in this character's journey in the same way that it would if episode 1 was the chronological beginning in our world of when we made these films, leading up to episode 6, if you understand what I mean. It exists at the time that it comes out with some level of awareness of the other stories that already exist. And what that means is that it's rare. It seems like the consequence of that is that it will be rare that watching a prequel first in a chronological viewing is the ideal way to engage with that material. Generally, like, you can watch the Star Wars series from beginning to end in chronological order, but, you know, if you watch them, the OT, then the prequels, then the sequels, it's not that, like, there's no problem there, and that's the way that most people viewed them originally, and they were probably made with that in mind. Or if not, if it wasn't that they were made with that in mind, the knowledge of the existence of the OT absolutely would have informed how the prequels were constructed. But it's hard to say how one ought to write a prequel. You know, should it serve as a good starting point for the new viewers, or should it be written with the knowledge that most people who intend to watch it have seen the original story? And what does that mean? I think the clearest example of what that means is that a lot of the time, prequels will lend greater significance to something that the writer is aware is significant in the minds of the viewer or the reader. So, like, for instance, in Revenge of the Sith, when we have our end scene of Vader, the Emperor, and Tarkin looking at the construction of the Death Star, you could say that narratively, that's totally fine. And it is totally fine narratively, but it's absolutely a scene that is in there because there is an awareness on the part of George Lucas that the Death Star is super important in Star Wars, and we see it in Episode 4, and that's something that we as an audience would love to see. That's a more simplistic example that isn't particularly consequential. The other one would be, like, the significance of a character interaction in a prequel, where it simply just wasn't that significant when it was originally written. Like, you can tell that it wasn't that important. I struggle to think of the examples right now, but I guess to make it clearer, you imagine two characters who interact in the original story, and there's nothing particularly important or special about it, but then we do a prequel story where those two have, like, an interaction that is significant, or something that results in their interaction is significant. Something pertaining to that interaction becomes significant for whatever reason that may be. I guess what I mean by that is that a prequel can retroactively make something that isn't significant be incredibly important, and that may be a misguided decision that one wouldn't have made if the stories were written in, if the chronological order of when the stories exist in their universe was the same as when they were written. That is a very long-winded way of me saying if the prequel was actually written first. You know what? Someone in chat has just reminded me of a really great example. The dice in the Falcon. That is a very, very good example of that in action. Something that wasn't important being given retroactive significance. In fact, Heirlooms is a really good example of that, actually, where, like, some little item that was never that important becomes highly significant because of a prequel story. That's a really great example, actually. I think the clearest challenge that comes with trying to create a prequel is that most people who are coming into it know how the story is going to end, and knowing how a story ends does change how somebody engages with a story. When you rewatch a film, the way that you're watching it is gonna... Now, to be clear, I don't think it's a lesser experience necessarily. I think that that's a dumb, reductive conclusion that some people draw. Knowing how a story ends, I think, simply changes the way that you engage with it. It doesn't make it lesser. Like, for instance, when I rewatched Batman the second time around, that was a different experience for me because I was watching it with an awareness of how it would end, and I was picking up on different details. I guess to make the point clear, the stakes in your mind are different because it's already known whether the good guy wins or survives. You can't latch onto the more overt stakes that a lot of stories have with, like, life or death because the ultimate outcome is known. You know, the good guy wins. Or maybe they don't, but the good guy wins. Like, when we're watching the prequels, we know that the bad guys are going to win in the prequels, and we know that the good guys are ultimately going to prevail, and we know that Obi-Wan isn't going to die, and we know that Anakin isn't going to die, and that Darth Vader isn't going to die, and we can logically infer that any characters that we don't see in the sequel era probably died, or at the very least were no longer significant anymore. This is a key challenge in my mind when writing a prequel, because it's hard to not think about that when you're writing it, and it's hard for the viewer to not think about these things as well. And so, when we look at Obi-Wan Kenobi, which is a prequel, how do we approach it? Everybody who's watching that show, basically everybody I doubt there's going to be many people for whom that is their first engagement with Star Wars. Most people, and even if it wasn't, they're probably aware of how it ends anyway, just because of how relevant Star Wars is to pop culture. You know, the vast majority of people who are watching Obi-Wan Kenobi will be watching it with the knowledge that Obi-Wan ultimately succeeds in his mission. He will protect Luke from discovery. Luke will come meet him at some point in the future. He'll train him. Obi-Wan dies, but Luke ultimately restores the Jedi and wins, only to then allow it to completely fall apart in the sequel trilogy and then become a hermit. Because his spirit animal is a hermit too. You know, everybody knows that that's the story that's taking place. So that we're not going to be deriving any stakes from, like, is when Obi-Wan and Darth Vader inevitably fight. You know, there's not going to be any fear of, oh no, is Obi-Wan going to survive? It's like, well, we know that he does, so you can't derive stakes from the more clear, overt, you know, from what is more overtly obvious to be stakes in a story. But that isn't to say that there are no stakes at all, because like I said, prequels can, I was focusing on how prequels can damage a character, but prequels can also enhance a character. That's entirely possible, of course it is. But how? How? I think it would be a great idea to write an Obi-Wan prequel story which presents Obi-Wan with a difficult choice rather than a conventional life or death battle where the stakes are significant, given that we know that he ultimately succeeds in his mission on Tatooine. I want him to be presented with a difficult choice that challenges his core, the core that we understand based on all the stories we've seen of him, and where that choice is going to leave us with an interesting, potentially strengthened or different perspective on who Obi-Wan is as a person. What if we present Obi-Wan with a choice which could determine Luke's fate, and the choice can be summed up as principle versus pragmatism? How strictly will Obi-Wan adhere to the Jedi Code if doing so could compromise Luke's safety and result in him being found by the Empire? Would he compromise a part of himself in pursuit of achieving a greater goal, the restoration of the Jedi Order through Luke? The clearest way I can think of this in my mind is we have a scenario where an Inquisitor, because we need to limit the scope of this. You know, if we blow this up into a massive scope, it's just gonna be a disaster from a world building perspective. What if we have like one Inquisitor who, in a place where Obi-Wan has the capacity to stop them, this person has realized, oh, there's a young Force sensitive, there's a kid on this planet who's going to be significant, and potentially destroy the Empire, and I, the Inquisitor, am gonna get them. And Obi-Wan is in a position where we know that he is going to prevent this from happening. We know that's gonna happen, but in the context of the story, this is a highly risky situation. And Obi-Wan is presented ultimately with two choices that can be summed up as he is going to do something that breaches the Jedi Code in order to kill this Inquisitor and prevent them from finding Luke, or he will refuse to compromise on the code, thereby placing Luke in greater danger, but he will make that decision and fight for it and ultimately succeed. That feels to me like the story that ought to be told if we're going to do an Obi-Wan prequel. We want to explore Obi-Wan. I want to know more about Obi-Wan and what he values, and specifically how he thinks about his values post the prequels in this new world where there is no Jedi Order. What does he think about the Jedi Order now? Does he have a negative feeling about the Jedi Order because he feels like their rigid ideology ultimately resulted in Anakin? And if that's the perception he has, how does that manifest? Does that manifest in him being cold and detached and much more ruthless and pragmatic? Or is he still desperately trying to cling onto better times? And does he still firmly believe in the Jedi Code? And more importantly, does he still believe that it is important to adhere to the Jedi? If we present this choice to him, the choice is ultimately, is it worth preserving the Jedi Code if the only way to do so is to breach the Jedi Code? What does it even mean for the code to exist if I'm going to breach it? Or am I going hardcore? Is it necessary at this point in time for the welfare of the galaxy, ultimately, to breach this principle, to go full consequentialist and make this choice in a way that damages, me, Obi-Wan, as an individual, but ultimately will bring about a greater good through Luke? Because we aren't going to be deriving any stakes from any battles that are actually being had in terms of who's going to win. A battle with Obi-Wan and Vader, it's going to be hard to establish stakes because we know that they both survive. And of course, you run the... I feel like that's going to be... you can do so much damage because it really feels like when they met on the Death Star, that was the first time they'd seen each other since the prequels. I just think that that the path that we ought to explore with Obi-Wan, if we're going to tell a story about Obi-Wan, by the end, I want to understand more about who he is rather than what he did, because we know he wins. And we know a lot about him, to be fair, but that middle ground, that middle portion of time, that feels like the time to explore the challenges that he dealt with, because he would have had a very challenging life in that period, not just in terms of surviving in this world, but also just dealing with a lot of questions. We should be exploring his perspective thoroughly. We are. I think if there's anything that I would want to make clear, we should be telling a small story. We should be telling a very low-key small story. We are not going to have an action scene every episode. We are doing a slow, contemplative, dialed down exploration of Obi-Wan as a character. We want to be looking at his perspective on himself, his failings with Anakin, and how things will be different this time. That feels like the clearest story. Things will be different this time. I failed last time, I won't again. I'll do whatever it takes to ensure that Luke is okay, and that he will be instilled with the lessons necessary to bring back the Jedi Order, to defeat the Emperor, to defeat the Empire and restore the Republic and the Jedi Order. These should be the thoughts that are going around in his mind constantly. His failings, how they should inform how he behaves now, and whether that will manifest in ways that make us rethink Obi-Wan, because we obviously have a very clear idea of who he was in the prequels. He is, basically a very stable person who has conviction in his beliefs and will fight for those beliefs vehemently. He's a good guy. Obi-Wan is a good person. A very balanced good person. But this era is the place where we can explore him more when he's off balance. The strength of prequels is that they can be potent in revealing how a character arrives at a certain place. And I think that when approaching this story, but also just approaching prequels in general, it really is about how do we get there. That's what we're there for. How did we arrive at the end? And you could broadly say that all stories are about the how and the why. It's not about the destination, it's about the journey. I guess it's just that I think it's pretty clear, however, like when we're watching a story and we know how it's going to end, that we have an investment in how it's going to end, and that's really important to us. It's the reason why spoilers are a thing. What do people care about spoilers if it has no bearing on, on influencing our enjoyment of the story? And I think in this case, it really is a focus on character rather than external plot that is going to be beneficial and yield the best results. But my concern is that we're not going to do that. My concern is that we are going to tell a hyper-conventional story that doesn't really challenge Obi-Wan, that is going to, in many ways, fall into the traps I think prequels can fall into, where there is a lot of significance placed on things that in-universe shouldn't be so significant right now. That there will be a lot of teasers of things to come in the future, that will be leveraging a lot of iconic imagery in a different context in this intermittent era between the prequels and the OT, that there simply won't be much of an interest in slowing it down, because it just isn't as easy to market a contemplative, low-key character study over another crazy, bombastic, super significant in-universe Star Wars story. This series being a limited series as well, they are really well positioned to do something great. But I really wonder if what at this point feels clear to me, the Disney Plus formula of telling a story as a series, that it is going to be very much beholden to baiting to make sure that you watch what's next, rather than a more organic exploration of character, that we need to bait Darth Vader, and we need to bait maybe Darth Maul, right? Like, who's gonna show up? Maybe, maybe we'll bait the Qui-Gon. We're gonna see the Qui-Gon I wouldn't put it past them. I wouldn't be surprised if they bait Qui-Gon. We've reached the point now where originally they didn't want anything to do with the prequels. They wanted nothing to do with them. But now, because of how badly the sequels went, pillaging the prequels is now very profitable, and everybody... I mean, we saw it, right? The reaction to that trailer was fueled massively by the use of Duel of the Fates. Like, the prequels at this point have just... It is ripe ground for pillaging. I guess I think with this Obi-Wan show, this is a great place to really push theme hardcore, to tie that character story into some theme that should be the greatest significance of the story. We are being low key. The stakes, the clear stakes aren't that important. We are exploring Obi-Wan, and by proxy, we're exploring what it means to be a Jedi. Perhaps here we'll get a clear understanding of why Obi-Wan takes the approach that he does with Luke in A New Hope and throughout the OT. Let's lend if any significance is given to stuff that happened in the OT or the prequels that we explore here, it's going to be about how Obi-Wan operates, and it's going to tell us a bit about what he thinks about the Jedi Code, and in a sense, what the Jedi Code ought to be. It is really ripe. But they all were, they all were. Like the Book of Boba Fett, there's a story there. Now that story would need so much work to be the story that I would want to tell. But there is a story there. There's a story in The Mandalorian. The Star Wars universe is ripe for great stories. It's absolutely ripe. It's a really awesome world with a variety of different players and groups and time periods where the dynamics are different. There's so much that you can do. All it takes is a little imagination, but it feels like the Disney era of Star Wars has been driven much more by marketing and selling of a service and getting people seats in the cinema rather than imagination and a legitimate, genuine interest in telling. It feels like Star Wars is reaching the point that Marvel is at. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that Disney wants Star Wars to be Marvel. They would love to have another Marvel, because everybody wants Marvel. Everybody wants what Marvel has with the MCU, where you can just readily pump out content multiple times a year, and everybody will it will always make its money back. And, thanks to Solo, we've reached the point where Star Wars is not necessarily 100% bankable. But it feels like Star Wars is being pushed to the point where the ideas follow the project. The project comes before the legitimate desire to tell a story. Like George Lucas clearly wanted to tell a story with the prequels. He clearly had a story in mind that he wanted to. Now, of course, he didn't do a great job of it, but I think you could see the richness in the prequels. The prequels is a rich era, and I think it shows in how many beloved Star Wars stories stem from that era, because it's so rich, and there was an idea there. But I don't know if that's the approach anymore, and it feels like that approach is just going to always lead to difficulties. Not always. It's not always going to do it. It just seems like the wrong way around. The idea should precede the project, not the other way around. It shouldn't be, we're going to make an Obi-Wan story, figure out what story you're going to tell in that setting. It should be, I had an idea for an Obi-Wan story. All right, let's do it. Let's explore this. And if it yields good results, let's make it. I just want my slow, contemplative Obi-Wan story where I learn more about him and my perception of him is either changed or reinforced, and we have a really strong thematic through line, and we don't do some crazy bombastic action scene where we have a whole bunch of characters that we can sell as toys, or we're setting up other series, or we're going to try and retroactively change aspects of the prequels or the original trilogy. I just want my character study. That's all I want. But whether that's what we're getting, whether that's the story that will be told, well, fingers crossed. That does it for me this week. Thank you very much for hanging out. This was Cosmoronic number 8. I'm Fringy, and I will catch you all next time.